This recording is the first in a series of recordings that look at the circulation. In this series of lectures, we'll be looking at the types of blood vessels that are involved, because the blood vessels actually form a closed system of tubes that carry blood away from the heart and then transport it to body tissues and then returns it to the heart. We'll also be looking at hemodynamics, which is actually the study of the forces involved in accomplishing that feat of transporting that blood through the blood vessels. We'll look at various concepts such as blood pressure, things that can affect blood flow, resistance. So those are some of the things that we'll be discussing. So this one is just an introduction to hemodynamics. So hemodynamics, I'd mentioned, is the study of forces involved in transporting that blood throughout our circulation. It's actually really the study of the circulation. And we have a series of blood vessels that will be transporting blood away from the heart to various tissues. And then that's where we're going to have, at the level of the capillaries, we'll have exchange. We'll be delivering nutrients, picking up waste products, and then that blood will be transported back to the heart. Now, one of the things I haven't mentioned is actually there's two different, we're going to break the circulation into two components. Is you have a systemic circulation, which is long. This is involves transporting blood from the heart to all of the body except the lungs. It's a much longer pathway. It does have a lot more pressure than we see in the pulmonary circulation. There's a lot more resistance involved in blood flow there, so pressure is going to be a little bit greater, or I should say quite a bit greater in the systemic circulation than in the pulmonary circulation. The pulmonary circulation is a smaller circulation. It's lower resistance, it's lower pressure, and this just involves the movement of blood from the heart up to the lungs, where we'll have the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Oxygen's going to come in and CO2 will leave. And then that blood is taken back to the heart, and then that blood is taken to your systemic circulation. So when we look at the different types of blood vessels that are going to be doing this transport, I've already mentioned capillaries. Now, capillaries is actually where exchange takes place. And there's a reason why exchange takes place within the capillaries, because of their structure. When we look at arteries and veins and arterioles, the makeup of those vessels are different, which dictates their function. So an important concept that comes into play when we talk about the circulation is complementarity of structure and function. So remember the concept that says function follows form. Well, it applies to blood vessels. So if you look at here a list of various types of blood vessels, we have a different makeup. What type of tissues make up those blood vessels? So if you notice here, this thing is called an elastic artery. Now, why do you think they call it an elastic artery? Well, it's because it has a large amount of elastic tissue. So the elastic arteries include things like your aorta and the pulmonary trunk. They have this large amount of elastic tissue, or we can say it has these elastin fibers in it, because when blood enters those vessels, the blood from the left ventricle is going to the aorta, blood from the right ventricle is going to the pulmonary trunk. The blood goes in there, they expand, they stretch out, but because of those elastin fibers, it wants to keep its original conformation, its original shape. It will rebound to go back to its original position, and this is going to allow blood to continue to flow through the circulation even though the ventricles are beginning to relax. So it permits them to kind of act as secondary pumps. And so the elastic arteries have a lot more of elastic tissue than they do smooth muscle. So muscular arteries have more smooth muscle than, say, elastic arteries. And if you also just compare a similarly sized artery and a vein. Arteries have more muscle than veins, and there's a reason for that. What was the purpose? Well, their arteries have to withstand much higher pressures than the veins, and so they have a lot more smooth muscle to allow them to withstand those higher pressures. Another thing, if you notice, is here, all the vessels have endothelium. So I'm actually going to mention that. So endothelium is that epithelial tissue. It's one layer of squamous cells that is, you don't call it simple squamous epithelium, it's called endothelium because it's biochemically different than, say, mesothelium or other simple squamous epitheliums like we say have in the alveoli of the lungs. Now, the endothelium is there in all of them, so that's fine. But you'll notice, look at the capillary. You don't see any elastic tissue. You don't have any smooth muscle. You don't see any fibrous tissue because the capillaries are thin-walled. All they have is an endothelium and a basement membrane. This is where exchange takes place. You want as thin of a distance, small a distance as possible for exchange to take place. So these are designed for exchange, and we'll even look at different types of capillaries. Some will be more permeable than others. And so you have different components of a blood vessel that serve different functions. And then the composition of a blood vessel may have more of one type versus the other. Now just think about another function of smooth muscle. Well, smooth muscle is what we call vasoactive. Vaso means vessel. Is certain substances can affect the contractility of smooth muscle. And so smooth muscle contracts, and I say I'm looking at the end of a blood vessel, then the lumen size gets smaller. That can affect blood flow. If smooth muscle relaxes, you're going to have what we call vasodilation. So here is vasoconstriction, there is vasodilation. That's going to allow for more blood flow. So smooth muscle will also play a role in controlling blood flow. We do have different amounts of smooth muscle in different blood vessels. Like I mentioned, we have different an amount of elastin fibers in blood vessels. So this is just kind of, looking at that concept of complementarity of structure and function and applying that to blood vessels. I also do want to mention, you should discuss this in lab too, is if you look at the size of the lumen in a vein versus a corresponding artery. So here's, say, even here versus here. The lumen sizes of veins are much bigger, and that's going to correlate to their role as being what we call capacitance vessels. And we will discuss this in the next recording, okay? So capacitance vessels, they have more capacity to hold blood. So I'm going to stop here. Next recording, we're actually going to look at those different types of vessels.